Our next speaker is Thomas Allen. Thomas is economist at OECD, the Sahel and West African Club Secretariat. Is that the Club de Sahel? Oui. Welcome.
Begins. End of winter. I don't feel the strength to be standing. I'll be sitting. So good morning. My talk this afternoon will focus on some of the major transformation in West Africa. And by the way, by West Africa, I will mean 17 countries in this region, the 15 ECOWAS countries, plus Mauritania and Chad. Why? Because the SWAC, the Sahel and West Africa Club, is a platform that gathered some OECD countries plus 3 West African regional organizations, which are ECOWAS, UMOA, and SEALS. The reason why we cover these 17 countries. So more precisely, my talk will focus on the development of a more complex and more modern food economy in West Africa, and what this transformation implies in terms of opportunities for the region, in particular for job creation. And a good starting point when one talks about West Africa is to remember, as we say, that West Africa is first of all urbanizing. West Africa's population, we know, has increased tremendously over these past 65 years, 5-fold. And this demographic boom has been accompanied by a spatial redistribution of population. And urbanization is the most visible manifestation of these spatial patterns. When one looks at a map with geolocalized data, such as this very simple map there on the screen, one can realize that cities are growing in size. These are the dark blue, but also in numbers. In 1950, we had in West Africa 150 cities, agglomeration. Today, it has reached to 2,000. So this demographic growth translated in the creation of a dense urban network of different agglomeration of very different size. We know that, but we are missing data on that. This is the first time we can plot such a data. This data comes from the Apricopolis data. We've been updating that data from 1950 to today for these 17 countries, and we are just launching a project to update the same data for the whole African, sub-Saharan African continent. It's available online on the OECD for the West African countries on the OECD website. And these urbanization dynamics are driving profound transformation in the economies and societies of the region. First, it is changing consumers' demand. Using recent expenditure and consumption data compiled by the World Bank, we were able to come up with some key facts about consumers' habit. So first, we observe changes in dietary patterns with urbanization. Urban dwellers are consuming more fruits and vegetables, more meat and fish than rural consumers. So as the region is urbanizing, these patterns provide the trend. There will be more demand for fruits and vegetables. There will be more demand for meat and fish because of these growing numbers of urban consumers, but because also these urban dietary patterns will diffuse to the rural areas. Second point that we need to highlight is that there is a growing demand for convenience, and it concerns both urban and rural areas. We estimated that processed foods, including light processed foods such as meat, represent today a minimum of 39% of the total food consumption of households in West Africa. And we can expect this share to keep on growing over the next decade. And as I said, it concerns both urban and rural areas. Urban households, of course, unsurprisingly, are greater consumer of processed foods compared to rural households, 41 against 36. But another interesting information is that even in the poorest income quartile, processed food represents 35% of their food consumption. So processed food are entering the household food basket at a low level of income. So this is the demand that the West African agricultural producers, food processors, retailers need to meet. But what is interesting as well is that this demand for food is changing, but it is big, it's huge. So using again these expenditure and consumption data, summing all of them, adjusting for the difference between surveys and national accounts, we were maybe for the first time for West Africa able to provide a reliable estimate of the size of this food economy. And by food economy, I mean all the system of activities from primary producers to consumers aiming at providing food. And we estimated that in West Africa, it amounts to $178 billion in 2010, the year for which we can provide reliable estimate. So that means it's 36% of the regional GDP. It is the first sector of West Africa. And by far, it is 5 times the size of the overall GDP of the second biggest economy of the region, Ghana. I can't compare it with Nigeria because Nigeria is big. And what I want you to understand from this data is that it invites us to reconsider some of our ideas on the West African food economy. First of all, I'm going too quickly. First of all, yes, imports have been increasing over this past decade, no doubt about that, in volume, and to a lesser extent, also in share of total production. But yet, the region food imports, estimated by the FAO to be about $12 billion in 2010, represent 7% of this food market, of this food economy. So that means that 93% of the food demand in West Africa is satisfied by local regional producers. And this regional production for regional consumers is about 16 times bigger than the regional agricultural export market. So West Africa has been massively redirecting its agriculture and economies towards its own market. And this domestic food market dwarfs that of the agricultural export market for the region. And it represents the main opportunities for the region in the coming decades. So, first, it represents massive opportunities for the region in terms of economic diversification. If we compare the GDP of this food economy with the agricultural GDP of the region, we can get an idea of the process of economic diversification and value addition within this food economy. So in 2010, the region's agricultural GDP amount to about $123 billion. A substantial share of these activities goes toward the export market. And some of these activities are not intended for human nutrition. If we adjust for these, we estimate that about 40% of these value added created within this food economy is no longer agriculture. It's outside farming. So even if agriculture remains a pillar of the economies and of the food economy, without any question about that, still there is a process of structural transformation within this food economy that we've got to account for. And that translates also into the employment opportunities of these food systems. So there we were not able to compute our own data. That's a program of work we have just started with the support of the GIZ. But there are other works that have been done on these issues, and we're building here on the work done by Michigan State Universities, which has done a work on different sub-Saharan African countries, including Nigeria. So the data I'm presenting there is of Nigeria today. They say 2016. And what we see is that first, the full-time equivalent job figure there indicate that off-farm activities represent a large share of this employment potential in the food economy. Michigan State University says for Nigeria 40%, about 40%. But what is interesting, also from these figures, is that these off-farm opportunities are largely in the commercial activities rather than the food processing yet. So, and this is consistent with the progressive spatial distanciation between production and consumption areas. So what it says is that, so that's a picture. It's difficult to have trends. We need to have more information on the trends. That's just a static picture for 2010. But still, it indicates that labor is moving out of farming, though we can ask the question at which rate of exit. So, what we can say is that downstream segments of the food value chain are going to provide more and more job, proportionally, but at the same time, yes, we know, in numbers, farming will continue to provide the largest amount in absolute numbers of jobs. So this doesn't make the situation easy, and we need to get a clearer idea as to the exact numbers of these job opportunities, and we'll be contributing to this work. But this dual situation reaffirm the need for a more comprehensive cross-sectoral approach to agricultural and food policy. There are, among others, a number of questions that we can ask, and I'm going just to tackle two of these questions that we think are interesting. First, who will benefit from these new jobs? Is the youth going to be well placed to have access to these jobs? That's the first question. And the second question is, where will those jobs, new jobs, created in space? So again, using MSU data, if we have a look at the current distribution of employment in the food system by age group, in Nigeria again, it indicates that youth are broadly distributed along the different segment of the food value chain. So that means there's no easy targeting for policymaker in terms of segment. There's no easy targeting for policymaker willing to target the youth. Contrary to women, where it's very clear that when it comes to food system, women are highly concentrated in food processing and food away from home. But what we see also is that the young adult, that means between 25 to 40, seems to be moving more significantly out of farming. So these patterns seem to indicate that youth would start in farming and might be considering options outside farming as they grow older. But there's no yet a clear picture, as there is for women. Another question is, what are the spatial patterns in the food economy? Of course, most of the agricultural activities in the food economy are taking place in the rural areas. But what we know is that we talked about that just a few minutes before, that the agricultural transformation in rural areas is happening at a very different speed across the region, across space, depending on location, depending on local context, and as Steve Wiggin highlighted, depending on the connections to markets. When it comes to market, we know where demand is concentrated. And that is what this map tried to highlight. Urban consumers consume on average, when it comes to food, 50% more than rural consumers because of price differential, because of different consumption structure, because of different income levels. So we know that 67% of the overall food demand is concentrated in urban areas, in cities and towns. And these cities and towns are not homogeneously spread in the region. 33% of this food demand is concentrated in the agglomeration along the coastal area of the Gulf of Guinea. So, yes, there is a strong need to help connect farmers, agricultural producers, to these urban markets over relatively longer distances. This is just a case study on Ouagadougou. which shows that 50% of the food that feed Ouagadougou comes from an average, from a buffer of 110 kilometers around Ouagadougou. And if you want to capture 80% of the food needed to feed Ouagadougou, you've got to extend this buffer to a radius of 300 kilometers. So relatively long distances, though the farmer closer to the city are going to be the most one, the close benefiting from these opportunities. So there is, when it comes to, before I conclude on that, when it comes to the off-farm activities of the food value chain, well, the retailing and marketing activities are very likely to take place in the vicinity of this consumer market, in proximity of where demand is. So there is a need to connect producers and consumers, but there is also a need to connect people to jobs, to good quality jobs. And this will create jobs. So what I want to say there is that there is a need for a geography of job of the food economy, and that is something that we will try to be looking at in the coming 2 years, because we're just starting a program of work on that. In conclusion, I just would like to recall my 3 main messages. First, so there are significant transformation in West Africa. Food demand is changing, and this is impacting very strongly the food systems in West Africa, and it is changing as a consequence also the opportunities in the coming decades for West Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas. It's quite impressive, the data supporting some of these conclusions. I mean, I think we knew that the demand from African urban centers is really growing and expanding, but to see that it's only, it's like 93% of the total demand is very impressive. So I think this data really gives us a lot of insight and really reinforces, I think, the policy messages that could be shared with governments and other policymakers. So it's really another impressive presentation. Thank you very much.